to Open World Chat. I am your host, Jim Dandino, and joined, as always, by John Odom. John, say hello.
Woohoo!
All right. And we are joined today by Matthew Byrd. Matthew is, like me, a denizen of Geek. Matthew covers the video game beat at our collective internet home Den of Geek, and he's written a number of spicy things about The Legend of Zelda. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you. That's all true.
It is all true. And the spiciest thing was your ranking of the stories. So can we talk about that? It's a little bit older in the year. It goes back a little ways. But as I missed Super Nintendo the first time through, and I only am just now getting to A Link to the Past. Wait, is it A Link to the Past? Which one is the Super Nintendo one? Why am I
you got
spacing?
Link to the Past.
Yeah, I'm just now getting to A Link to the Past on Switch. I feel like that's the one that I want to talk about because I'm also kind of not a huge fan of Breath of the Wild.
Oh,
interesting.
That is interesting.
I like the gameplay well enough, but I kind of generally hate open world games because they're too directionless. The story doesn't get told in a coherent enough manner that it makes sense I get deep into it, which is weird, even though because my favorite Zelda game of all time is Wind Waker.
Ooh.
And that's kind of open world.
Yeah.
So if you're wondering, Matthew, Jim was not here when we started the podcast, and I named it. So that's if that that
does make a little more sense. Yeah.
Yes. I am technically a long-term replacement. I'm just temping here.
It's funny because I was in the Zelda, I guess kind of a bubble with Zelda where I just thought everyone loves Breath of the Wild. It was a big hit, came out, changed everything, universally beloved game. And really over the last few years, I've seen a lot of Zelda fans who are kind of like, yeah, it's not my thing. It's like, I don't know what it is, didn't speak to me or whatever. It's not that it's a bad game. It just wasn't for me. And I think it is that thing, where it's like, it's not, if you're a Zelda fan, it doesn't mean you're a Breath of the Wild fan,
Mm-hmm.
It's really the first game in the series, I think, that was really true of. And I think that threw a lot of people off.
I think it's a beautiful game. I think it's one of the best technical accomplishments of the Switch generation. It's just, the final boss fight in Wind Waker is always going to stick with me, right? The kind of darkness and bleakness of Twilight Princess is always going to be there. For all of its problems, Skyward Sword was phenomenal. But Breath of the Wild, I really liked Skyward Sword. I really like the kind of story. I really like the immersion.
I like the story. It's just the gameplay. I just,
the Wiimotes are, they were tough, and they still are. I came to that one late too. I didn't get a Wii until like 5 years ago. So
I think I wrote an article at one point that was basically in defense of Skyward Sword, which is essentially, it's not the best game, but like it got a really bad rap for years. And I think the Switch remake, which kind of removed the motion control issues, really showed like, this is kind of like a peak traditional Zelda game.
Yeah, it is very traditional.
It's also, I think, the lickety-split nature of it, though, comes through. I know we're just sort of freestyling this here, but I think it's the way it's going to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm not mistaken, Skyward Sword was the one where they were working on the new game for 3 or 4 years, and then they just threw everything out that they did, and then they knocked out Skyward Sword in about a year. And
is that true?
That's my understanding. Matthew, does that sound familiar to you?
That does sound familiar. Yeah. I don't know if it was a matter of like throwing it out necessarily, but I do think it kind of came together because it was also in that awkward transition period between, the Wii U and the Wii. It was closer to that. So I think there was that kind of awkward transition period with the design where they were like, maybe didn't know which direction to go in so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It does feel, now that I think about it does feel kind of like 3/4 Wind Waker and like a quarter Twilight Princess, right? Because all the time in the air is very much like sailing around to the islands.
That's definitely the Wind Waker influence. Although, and I think you'll agree, Wind Waker does it significantly better.
Oh, way better.
Yeah.
Your point about time being kinder to the graphics in Wind Waker is absolutely correct. I think I remember the outcry about the cell shading at the time, and I thought it was a little bit silly then. But then you had basically an entire era of games stealing that style, right? Like you had Beautiful Joe, you had all of these side-scrolling beat 'em ups that were cell shaded exactly the same, and people loved them. They were fantastic. They were, lots of them were very well received, and I think that the fact that so many other games stole the visual style from Wind Waker, I think helped with that critical reappraisal.
I got caught up in that too because I didn't own a GameCube at the time. So it was, I had the Xbox, my friend had the GameCube, we swapped on games, whatever. So, it's hard to get into Zelda GameCube if you're having to like swap for a weekend or, what have you, try to dive into it piece by piece. So I came to Wind Waker more during the re-releases. And yeah, it's a phenomenal game. And I wouldn't say I was caught up in the cel shaded hype at the time, but definitely the narrative I was getting was, it's like, yeah, whatever, it's fine, but like, it's not that demo they showed. It's not this incredible, revolutionary, dark fantasy Zelda game we were all expecting. So, it's kind of a disappointment. And it is interesting how, the GameCube in a lot of ways was Nintendo really trying to experiment with a lot of their franchises, especially with Wind Waker, Metroid Prime, Mario Sunshine, which are these like kind of weird footnotes in those individual franchises. And, Mario Sunshine maybe is the outlier in that group, and it's still got kind of a mixed reception. But I think now all those, those games are like really put on a pedestal. And it is interesting to go back to Breath of the Wild, where it's like this, it's kind of the same deal where, that game came out swinging. That game was a monster when it came out, just widespread critical reception, just seemed like everyone loved it. And then it kind of had that popularity curse where it's like, well, it's so popular, we kind of have to check what the inverse of this is. Like, There are problems with this game. There is a backlash to this game, et cetera. Whereas Wind Waker's like, it's like, it came out, it was kind of mixed or whatever. And now we look back to the mixed reception. It's like, what was everybody talking about? This game's phenomenal.
Yeah. A lot of people reacted to the style, the extra cartoony style, which is sort of strange when you think of it in the context of, it's a cartoony game. But I remember some pushback on that, as it was just too much for people. It was too much,
Those people are clearly wrong.
Yeah.
I agree.
They have been forever.
No, they have been forever, but I will say in retrospect, as a youth of an undisclosed age at that time, I too was like, yeah, I want that Dark Zelda game they showed, it was this big deal at the time because I was, that was also on the precipice of like things like, that was basically on the precipice of like the gritty reboot era where people were like, give us gritty, realistic Zelda. And it's like, now it's so easy to look at that game and appreciate all the things it was trying to do and all the things it did so well.
Yeah. I'm going to completely disclose my age. I was in college with my GameCube. Actually, I was just out of college, I think, with most of my time with my GameCube. And I think that's my favorite system of all time.
Mm.
I really liked Super Mario Sunshine. I think Metroid Prime 2 is definitely one of the high points of that franchise. GameCube had the good Super Smash Brothers. GameCube had the controller that they've been mimicking for every system since. They still release GameCube controllers for competitive Smash Brothers play.
Yeah, that console was around forever, and it didn't have to be. I mean, Nintendo and its bizarre business model, which seems to be designed to make as little money as possible. It was forever before you waited till the Wii. But even when that first Wii came out, everybody kept their GameCubes around. It was everybody had them.
I
might spend some college funds on a GameCube for the house so that I can get the kids into it.
There was a story years ago that we kind of reported on from a website called Not Enough Shaders, which I don't think is around anymore. But basically, they were talking to marketing executives who were working with Nintendo around the time the GameCube. And Nintendo's kind of vibe at that time was, I don't get why we're losing the PlayStation and an Xbox. We're Nintendo. What's happening? Like, I don't understand. It's like, shouldn't everyone love us? We're Nintendo. And there was kind of that vibe at the time that like they were like, well, we can do no wrong, which on the one hand, was brilliant for us because they got to experiment with all those franchises. And they're like, it's okay if we go in these like weird directions because we're Nintendo and it's all going to work out in the end. On the other end, it was obviously kind of bad from a business perspective because the GameCube wasn't really a big market success. And they kind of had to pivot to the Wii to doing their own thing. But, it's funny because hardware-wise, they did do their own thing with the Wii, but software-wise, the GameCube was really the prime example of they're like, we're just going to do our own thing. We're not going to care about the reaction.
Yeah.
The GameCube was not a commercial success. I just remember everybody had one.
Not compared to like Xbox and PlayStation, and I think it's the worst selling Nintendo console by a fair margin. Oh yeah. It was, there was a lot of reasons. They had a lack of third party support. There was there were more like mature games at the time. They were becoming more popular, which is part of the reason of the Zelda blowback actually. And, that wasn't really like their wheelhouse outside of like the Resident Evil games. There was a lot of reasons that contributed to it. The GameCube's a system that's like easy 11 in retrospect. I'm sure they're like, well, we wish everyone that loves it in retrospect had bought it at the time because we would have been a lot better off.
But it also set them up to make the switch to the Wii, and the Wii is still the best-selling console of all time, right?
PlayStation 2 is just ahead of it, but yeah, it's way up there. It's definitely the best-selling Nintendo console.
Yeah, I'm looking at a list of GameCube games, and I am stunned. I remember playing all of these. Right, the high point of Super Smash Brothers, 2 Metroid Primes, Wind Waker, Eternal Darkness, which was nuts. That game was a mess. Rogue Squadron 2. I drank a not insignificant amount oftentimes and just sat and played the horde mode on that game for hours. F-Zero, is that the last F-Zero game?
I'm afraid so, yeah.
Oh my God, what are they doing? I mean, they've got F-Zero maps in Mario Kart now, but it's not the same. Beautiful Joe, the good Soul Calibur with Link in it. Oof, man, what a time.
I think part of the weird problem is, a lot of the games you're talking about are kind of generally considered to be underrated. The GameCube is kind of like the home of the underrated, right? Where it's like, it's great in retrospect to look back and be like, hey, those things are great. But at the time, people were like indifferent or even, as the case of Wind Waker, maybe even like actively angry towards it.
Yeah. Oh, Beautiful Joe. People hated that game when it came out, I think, didn't they?
Yeah. I mean, the entire Capcom lineup they had, where it was like, I'm going to forget now. It was like Beautiful Joe. Was that Killer 7 or did that come later?
I think that was Killer 7. Okami was around then too, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was like there was a couple. I'm forgetting the big Capcom 5 they had lined up where like Resident Evil 4 was the breakout of those and everything else was kind of like in the middle, even though like all of them are kind of like at least like really respected now. But that was the weird thing about the GameCube is that, again, we could look back on and be like, oh man, it was a creative powerhouse and a commercial failure. Yeah. Which is, again, to your point, kind of how we ended up with Breath of the Wild, where they're like, well, open world's the thing, we got to pivot in that direction at some point.
Yeah. I feel like at some point I should probably try and replay Breath of the Wild from the start and just do the main missions and not get distracted by the side stuff.
It's a great story. It's a lot of and I love the gameplay. The
gameplay is great. The map is gorgeous. The stuff that you do on the side missions is cool. It's just like it happens to me with every open world game, right? Fallout kills me because I get so wrapped up in doing all of the side stuff and get lost for 4 days at a time worth of gameplay trying to pull off side missions that I can't that I lose the thread of the main story and it doesn't hit as hard.
Well, give them full cred. They needed a new Zelda game and they needed to go big because it had been so long. I mean, the last games we had before that were the 3DS games that nobody remembers.
3DS and also Skyward Sword had kind of a mixed reception. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Triforce Heroes. Well,
so
all right. The link between worlds. Yeah.
So what is everyone's favorite Zelda game? I'm clearly on the record here. Who wants to fight me?
Here's the thing. I go back and forth between A Link to the Past and Wind Waker for absolute favorite.
Oh, interesting.
Now, the thing is this, because you were talking about, I had written about the best Zelda stories. And let's see, I had to look it up myself. I think Wind Waker was number 3.
Yep.
And Link to the Past may have been like number 10. That wasn't really a strong suit. It's funny because there's that weird disconnect with like what makes a great Zelda game, and even though it's not necessarily purely the story, to your point about Breath of the Wild, there was points where I'm playing, I'm like, this is beautiful. This is incredibly well made. This is I cannot fault this from a design perspective whatsoever. There were times where I'm like, I kind of miss a traditional Zelda game. Mm-hmm. And I think that with A Link to the Past, to me, that is the definitive traditional Zelda game. That's the game that's like the wellspring for most Zelda games that would follow. And with Wind Waker, I feel like that's the point where they were like, how can we retain most of the elements that matter most to that traditional formula, but also try to expand beyond it in some kind of like interesting ways that are true to that formula, but are also going to feel a little different to everybody who's been following us up until this point. Wind Waker is just a creative masterpiece. It really is. It's a shame it wasn't well respected, more well respected at the time. Because I would have loved to have seen the timeline, not the Zelda timeline. That thing's a mess.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, the real world timeline of what would have happened to the franchise if Wind Waker had been more of a hit in its day. But yeah, I don't know. There is that part of me that's like, there's something about those traditional Zelda games, no matter how old the formula gets or what have you, it still sings.
Well, like Breath of the Wild drove Switch sales for a couple of years, right? Like, you're absolutely right. What does the gaming world look like if Wind Waker drove GameCube sales the same way that Breath of the Wild drove Switch sales? Do we get a Wii at that point? Or do they not take the chance?
I think, if the GameCube had been a success, I definitely don't think we get the Wii. Now,
really? Wasn't it time for a new console though, regardless? I mean, certainly...
It was time.
What's that?
It's time for a new console. I don't know if we get the Wii exactly as it was, because the Wii was like, okay, we need to do our own thing. We cannot release the powerful modern, video game console that's going to compete with what PlayStation and Xbox are doing. The Wii needs to be uniquely Nintendo. It needs to be its own thing, and that was kind of a course correction for them, where they were like, okay, we need to lean into our identity more. Now, I don't know if motion controls helped Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword necessarily, which were the two big, Wii Zelda games. But I do think that the Zelda franchise may have evolved about the same as it did if Wind Waker had been a bigger success. Because I think they looked at that game and were like, we know we did right, and maybe history will prove us right on that. I do think the evolution in Nintendo hardware is probably different if games like Super Mario Sunshine and Wind Waker were a little more bigger successes in their time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, again, my favorite, since we hadn't gotten around to me here, my favorite Zelda game is clearly Hyrule Warriors.
John.
Yeah, okay.
You couldn't even you couldn't even go with Adventures of Link. You couldn't even be on brand Old Man Odom and go on with Zelda 2.
Well, bearing in mind that I've only really gotten into about 6 or 7 of these games. Yeah. My favorite in general is Twilight Princess. Just the combination of gameplay, story, the look, the sort of sad ending. I just love it. But I want to give a special shout out to Majora's Mask, which is just so interesting, such a creative, such a vision, such a wonky, what are they doing? Where did they come up with this story? That that's almost enough right there to take it for me.
It is wild. That was the other N64 Zelda game. It was almost like the afterthought.
Yeah.
I
don't think Majora's Mask is one of those games where I don't think anybody can ever. People can argue with you, but nobody can really tell you you're wrong with any kind of certainty. Majora's Mask is just so weird. It is. It's such an odd story. It's such an odd game. And coming on the heels of Ocarina of Time, which I feel like even then was widely considered to be one of the greatest games of all time.
Oh yeah.
Well, that was revolutionary.
That game came out the same year as Metal Gear Solid and Half-Life. And that was the game everyone was talking about. They were like, this is it.
Right. So like anything that was going to come after that was going to be constantly in its shadow. But like, I feel like Majora's Mask is another one where time has been critically very kind to it because it was just so different from Ocarina of Time, but like still did all of the same things that Ocarina of Time did well.
I think with Majora's Mask too, recently, I don't know if I guess people have been celebrating the anniversary of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which was a movie when it was released, it was almost universally hated. Now it's like kind of considered to be a masterpiece. I think the thing with Majora's Mask is that it's one of those games where it's like there are flaws in that game that are worth pointing out. But like the things it does well are like so bold and so different that like as time goes on and, maybe things become a little more stagnant on the AAA scene, it's so much more easy to appreciate like how much those things it did well and how much those things it did different stand out above like maybe some of its flaws.
Minish Cap is undergoing a little bit of a resurgence of interest. And I'm like, Minish Cap, really? Am I making that up?
I mean, I will say this. I definitely remember playing Minish Cap when I had a GBA, and I was like, this thing's incredible. I've always been a Minish Cap fan. I do think that I think it goes back to Breath of the Wild, where it's like there has been this like, not widespread, but there has been a notable Breath of the Wild backlash in some circles. I think when you look back at a game like Minish Cap, which was this small Zelda adventure designed for a handheld device in the traditional fashion, people are like, we kind of want that for the Switch. Like it doesn't have to replace Breath of the Wild, but it's like this is also kind of the thing we also want to have available for the Switch.
Well, I confess little to no, by which I mean no familiarity with the Game Boy stuff. The DS stuff I got into some, but so I shouldn't sound like I'm trashing talk Minish Cap,
No, it's interesting. It is, every now and then the internet will kind of latch onto this project that, whether it was overlooked or whether just not appreciated enough for any reason, try to like elevate it to a new level. I think the Minish Cap's definitely one of those games that deserves it, respected in its time. But again, in the evolution of the Zelda franchise and the evolution of gaming in general, it's very easy to look back at that game and be like, just this pure Zelda experience with some really creative ideas, tons of fun, good story, good atmosphere, good world. And just like, it's like there's kind of an absence of this and we really miss that.
I want to make sure that we hold some time to talk about how unbelievably shitty the cartoon is.
I think you said it all right there.
We picked up the Switch right before the second baby was born because I wanted something to do with the older kid. And so we would wander around the Breath of the Wild world together, and that got her into Zelda. And now she picks Link when we play Mario Kart against each other. She loves the franchise. I downloaded the Tubi app one day, and I'm like, there's a Zelda cartoon. Why don't we check it out? Oh my
I know.
God.
Nintendo grips that IP with a death grip, and then the one time they actually license it out, this
is why. That's why it's so unbelievably bad. And it's not just the animation, right? It's incredibly 80s. It's written like a Honeymooners episode, right? Like it's just so overbearingly sexist and like not of its time sexist. It's like he's a dick. He is a giant asshole to the princess. And I now I hear the kid repeating lines from it. I'm like, I want to go back in time and take Zelda away from you if this is where it's going to end up.
What have you done?
To that point, though, Nintendo used to be a lot more liberal with their franchise licenses. I mean, there's the Bob Hoskins Mario movie, which I love, but you know what? It's like, I get it. But
very weird.
Yeah. The thing is, but it's a not 0% possibility of things like that Zelda series are a big part of the reason why they are not so liberal with that franchise anymore.
Right. No, that's fair. Although I do miss my Mario 2 fruit snacks.
Yeah.
Someday. All right, John, let's go back to the games. What do you want? What do you got?
I was just wanted to get into I'm before multiverses were quite cool, Nintendo trying to retroactively cram in continuity and creating a Zelda multiverse. that I just find that endlessly interesting. Why would they do that? And then the lines they've actually laid out where the timelines split, and then there's this other third timeline which sort of doesn't have anything to do with anything. But they lay it all out in their literature now, which would place chronologically, Skyward Sword as the first, and then they break off at
it's Ocarina of Time is where the branch,
yes,
of course,
right,
of course,
yep,
yeah, that makes sense. What do we think of that? Is that something we just ignore when we play the games, or is it actually fun? Is it actually interesting? Is it something that sucks us in?
I'm going to hand this to Matthew.
It's a funny thing because again, I think there are certainly Zelda fans who talk about the timeline, the inconsistencies, and the frustrations with trying to deal with piecing it all together from a lore perspective. Because there are a lot of fascinating lore bits that never quite connect the way you want them to. But it's also one of those weird things where it's if every franchise did this, it'd be a mess. If every TV show was lost, we'd all be very angry. Mm-hmm. But there's kind of this weird thing with the Zelda franchise where it is this hodgepodge timeline that kind of makes sense, but also doesn't, where again, it's part of the weird romanticism of the franchise because it's so different from everything else out there, where there's the definitive timeline, there's the explainers, there's the series Bible, there is all this, and it's lock and key, whereas Zelda's a little bit wild still in kind of a fun way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I approach each game like they're not in any kind of remote continuity to each other, and piecing it together afterwards is fun, but I just treat every game as if it's a new experience, basically.
I couldn't help myself. Breath of the Wild comes out, I'm like, okay, how's this all gonna fit? I get sucked into it too. I think it's fun. It
does though, doesn't it? Breath of the Wild fits into Ganondorf's origin story, doesn't it?
There's the rumors for Breath of the Wild 2 that's one of the angles they're going to explore. Breath of the Wild is still kind of they've explained where it is on the timeline, kind of.
Have they? I've not heard that. Where is
it? They've offered a loose explanation of where it is. It's kind of ambiguous, and the thought is that the sequel may clarify a little bit where it is. There's kind of this idea that it's an apocalyptic version of at least one of the timelines. And that, maybe Breath of the Wild 2 will actually go all the way back in time to kind of be the inverse of where it is in the timeline. So yeah, but I think that's the thing about Zelda. Again, where it's a fantastic Wikipedia rabbit hole to fall down, is trying to figure out the timelines. Now, when you're trying to do it through the process of actually trying to play the games and piece together all the information, it can often be frustrating. And like you said, I think a lot of people are just I just treat each one like its own thing, and it really doesn't matter. But I kind of do respect how, if you want to go down that road, it leads you to a lot of fascinating paths. It's out there, but it's not strictly necessary.
Right. I mean, we are comic book nerds here, in addition to everything else nerds, basically. Yeah. So, who the hell are we to condemn anybody else's bizarre twisting and overwrought continuity?
Well, I think you need to ask yourself that, because I think Matthew and I were both okay with it.
I am okay with it. I'm okay with it. It's just I like I said, I don't have the mental acuity or bandwidth to keep track of the story in an open world game. I definitely don't have the mental bandwidth and acuity to keep track of three separate branches of the Hyrule timeline as I'm playing an open world game, trying to figure out exactly where in which of the three timelines it fits.
I respect I respect that something like that would not exist today. Now, take it for what it's worth, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I respect that it's so absurd and wild and uncharted in a lot of ways. It's something nobody would ever do today, and it's kind of weirdly wonderful in that sense.
Right. No, I agree. I think you're seeing the MCU right now kind of collapse inward on itself, because they're twisting themselves in knots trying to explain all the various continuity flaws in the TV and the movies and the different tie-in stories. Whereas Zelda's just fuck it, it's probably right here.
It's this was the bad WandaVision timeline, this is the good WandaVision timeline. Right. It's maybe they had the right of it.
Right.
Well, I'm just hoping and praying in Breath of the Wild 2 that there's some corner or side quest or something you could go around and then find you some, tracks from Spirit Tracks and Choo Choo Train. Oh man. I want the train bad.
I love what Spirit Tracks tried to do. I'm not saying it quite got there, but I love that idea. They're like, what if Zelda betrays? And they're like, that's the thing where it's like, what other developer is going to do that? It's like, and maybe they shouldn't, but Nintendo does, and it tends to work in their favor.
What do you hear about Breath of the Wild 2? I mean, it seemed like there's a lot of mixed. It was going to be this year, and now it's that year, and where are we at with that?
No, they're pushing it to next year. I think that's it's not expected. There's been a lot of delays in general, in the industry because of COVID and other factors. There's still a lot of fallout from that. And Nintendo obviously has always worked on kind of like their own timeline when it comes to these games. It's funny because it's one of those things where they're like, it's Zelda and now it's Breath of the Wild, which is kind of like its own level of popularity. So they're like, we really don't have to say a lot about it. It's like people are going to kind of buy it and buy into it regardless. So they really are trying to keep a lot of it under wraps. Like until now, it's been kind of like titled Breath of the Wild sequel, or like unofficial Breath of the Wild sequel, where it's like we don't even have a proper title to it because they're like, well, if we told you the title, it would give too much about the story away, which is hilarious given everything we've said about the story. It's like you could tell us the title and the plot description, most people probably wouldn't be able to make a lick of sense of it anyway.
You get three-quarters of the way through the game, they won't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it is kind of that fascinating thing where it's like, we really don't know a lot about it. And the hype is entirely based off the fact that Breath of the Wild was really good. Zelda has historically been incredible, and that's it. Which again is kind of the other fascinating thing about the franchise. Like, that's good enough. A lot of companies, a lot of developers aspire to get their franchises to that level. And Zelda is really one of the only ones that operates at that level.
And it operates at that level consistently across a ton of games, right? Yeah. It's not like Metroid. Every Metroid game I've played, and I haven't played whatever Project M is the bad one.
You're fine, yeah.
Yeah, I don't intend to. But every Metroid game that I've played has been stellar, right? But there's only 7 of them. 1, 2, 3 on the Game Boy, and then the 3 Metroid Primes.
With the remakes maybe used, yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't played Dread yet either, but I assume that's really good. That's probably on my list. Yeah. So Dread plus the 3 Metroid Primes plus the Super Nintendo, regular Nintendo, and the Game Boy one. All 6 of those, or all 7 of those, really good. But there's only 7 of them. They come out. You get a new one every 8 years at this rate. Whereas Zelda, you're getting a new Zelda game every 2 or 3 years, and I'm sure there are a couple of stinkers in there, but for the most part, they're all some of the best games that come out that year, right?
I don't know if there's a universally worse Zelda game, to be honest. I don't think there's a Zelda game that reaches below the level of pretty good. Mm-hmm. Maybe Zelda 2, Adventures of Link, talking about earlier, which is kind of like the wild card of the series. But again, with A Link to the Past, especially, they were like, okay, we have the formula. We can only deviate so much from this formula, and it's still not a pretty incredible game.
Going back to Breath of the Wild 2, should we be braced for something really lazy?
I don't think it's to Nintendo to be lazy. I think my worry at this point is that Breath of the Wild, to a degree, kind of came out of nowhere. It was a Zelda game, but it was also it split a release with the Wii U and the Switch, but essentially it was a Switch game. So it's okay, new hardware, Zelda launch game, that's unusual for Nintendo. Open world, that's wild. These bizarre survival mechanics. A lot of people didn't know what to make of that. And then, there's been some dissent, but a lot of people got into it, or at least I really respect the design decisions they made there. And this was completely unexpected. Everyone's expecting Breath of the Wild 2. So either they're going to be this is more Breath of the Wild, and Breath of the Wild fans are probably going to be okay with that, or they're no, we're going to try to go in a completely different direction with this, whatever that may look like. And that's going to be up in the air, because I think Zelda has its own expectations as a franchise, but now Breath of the Wild kind of has its own expectations as a concept. I fundamentally trust in Nintendo that they're going to do their best to make a great Zelda game. I don't know how they're going to make a great Breath of the Wild sequel, but I'm very excited to see.
I'd be interested if it was not a Breath of the Wild sequel. I mean, story-wise, I would be interested in a Breath of the Wild sequel, but I think I would also, I don't know, I guess it's probably obvious from my kind of sort of ambivalence toward the first game, but I wouldn't have a problem with them trying to take some more chances and do something more different than they're used to doing.
There was the idea, even at the time of Breath of the Wild's release, that Breath of the Wild may become its own thing. And then, like kind of like how with Pokemon, you have the mainline Pokemon series, and then they just released Arceus, which is kind of its own thing, but it is also a major Pokemon release. There's kind of that idea that Breath of the Wild may be its thing. And then maybe at some point before the Switch's life cycle is over, they're like, okay, like here's the more traditional Zelda game we might have released on a handheld once upon a time, but now it's coming to Switch. I think that's a realistic world, but there's also a possibility that Breath of the Wild 2 is also just such a juggernaut that they're like, this is it.
Yeah, I think with Breath of the Wild 1 being as overwhelmingly successful, I don't think they can deviate too much from that formula.
Well, it's also not like the Avatar 2 situation where it's like they waited so long and there's like kind of a mixed reception is developed where they're like, we don't know where we're at with this franchise. It's like, no, people want Breath of the Wild 2. That's not a question. Yeah. It's like whether or not they're in a position to deliver in it. And, what a great Breath of the Wild sequel even looks like is kind of up for debate.
Well, I'm down with it. I can't wait. I'm counting the hours, man.
I'm there. I'm there on launch day. For all my complaining and for all my old man whining about open world games, I'm 100% there on launch day. I don't care.
I would love if they also release, a more traditional Zelda game, like the kind they would have released on the 3DS or DS or GBA long ago, as a kind of like companion piece to Breath of the Wild 2. But yeah, I'm all for Breath of the Wild 2. Again, it's just the consistent quality of this franchise, not even quality, but like the consistent greatness of this franchise over a more than 35-year period of time. That's just like, it's kind of hard to not have a little faith in them.
And then there's the music.
What I hum the dungeon theme whenever I'm in trouble from Zelda 2. It's Tetrisy a little bit.
It is. It's like, even if that's the worst Zelda game, it's a pretty great game.
It took me 7 years to beat that game.
Yeah,
shit. I was talking to my brother about this the other day. We got our Nintendo in '89, and I did not beat that until well into high school.
Yeah, I never played Zelda 2.
It's on Switch. It's on the Switch Unlimited thing. Mm-hmm. So you should go try it. It's very different, very weird.
Well, I think we've firmly established that it's still dangerous to go alone. So.
Exactly.
I'm going to go upstairs and grab an edible.
Treat your local chickens with a little respect. You never know when they're going to turn on you suddenly, violently, and in packs.
It's true.
Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We will have you back to chat about other video games in the near future.
Oh, that's definitely all I'm good for. So believe me, I'm here.
Well, if you want to shout about other things, we shout about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
If you'll ever do a podcast on the 1982 movie Creep Show, I'll be there. Otherwise, I'm here for video games.
All right. We'll put you on the Creep Show list. I think we do have a horror movie episode that we need to put on the schedule in the not too distant future.
80s horror.
We could do it. 80s horror roundtable.
80s horror. Yeah.
All right. I'm into it. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It has been a blast, and I look forward to talking to everybody again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Matthew.
Well, if it's just under 30 seconds, it's all right. It's allowed. Legal. Yeah. No.